we shall bind up the nation's wounds and cherish peace.
Yes, indeed. If a young man makes up his mind to work, there's no limit to what he can do.
Self-determination.
We're not necessarily those seasoned professionals.
Abraham Lincoln, Henry Ford, Martin Luther King, 넬슨 만델라, 스티브 잡스. 더 이상 이런 사람들을 만나보기가 어렵습니다. 이젠 그립기까지 합니다. 지금 우리는 히어로가 없는 세상에 살고 있습니다. 만화 속 히어로들이 영화화되는 세상이죠. 왜 그럴까요? 히어로를 찬양하던 여러분들이 나서지 않았기 때문입니다. 자신이 히어로가 될 수 있다고 1도 생각하지 않기 때문입니다. 합리적이고 똑똑한 사람들은 이미 자신을 세상에 맞춰 잘 타협하고 살아갑니다. 스스로 평범하다고 생각하는 여러분들이 나서서 히어로가 되어야만 세상은 전에 들어보지 못했던 미래를 맞이하게 될 겁니다. 여러분은 지금 어둡고 긴 터널을 지나고 있습니다. 스스로를 구원하십시오. 오랫동안 묵혀뒀던 진짜 자신을 깨우십시오. 그리고 가능하다면 세상을 구해주십시오. 울트라셀프. 퀴즈 하나 내보겠습니다. 당장 이걸 하면 마음의 안정을 되찾지만 계속하면 할수록 장기적으로는 부정적인 결과가 나오는데요. 이걸 뭐라고 부를까요? 바로 중독입니다. 그런데 중독이라는 말이 각자에게 와닿는 정도는 모두 다를 겁니다. 미국 중독의학회에 따르면 중독은 뇌장애입니다.
The official definition of addiction, according to the American Society for Addiction Medicine, it's a primary brain disorder. It arises in the brain, largely due to genetic reasons. And I say that's just not true.
솔직히 중독은 마약 성분 있는 약에만 해당되는 거 아니에요? 제가 적당히 게임을 하거나 과식을 할 때는 있지만 중독 정도는 아닌 것 같은데요. 중독이 뇌장애다 라고 하면 충분히 나올 수 있는 반응입니다. 특정 중독 패턴에서 벗어나고 싶다면 이 사람들은 딴 데서 답을 찾아야 할 겁니다. 헝가리 출신 심리학자 겸 외과 의사가 말하는 중독의 정의를 들어보시죠.
So an addiction is a complex psychological, physiological process, but which manifests in any behavior. So craving pleasure, relief in the short term, negative consequences in the long term, inability to give it up. Now, notice I has said nothing about substances. I said any behavior. So it could be related to cocaine, crystal meth, heroin, fentanyl, marijuana, nicotine, alcohol, whatever. Could also be sex, gambling, internet, relationships, shopping, work, eating, work, extreme sports, working out, pornography, any number of human activities.
더 놀라운 점은 마약 성분이 있는 약물을 접해도 모든 사람이 중독되는 건 아니라고 합니다.
It's a myth that drugs are addictive. Drugs are not by themselves addictive because most people who try most drugs never become addicted. So the question is, why are some people vulnerable to be addicted? Just like food is not addictive, but to some people it is. Shopping is not addictive, but to some people it is. Television is not addictive, but to some people it is.
이 말은 특별히 중독되기 쉬운 상태의 사람들이 있다는 건데요.
The other popular idea about addiction is that it's a choice that somebody makes, that people choose to be addicted, which is what the legal system is based on. Because if people are not choosing, what are we punishing them for?
중독을 애착의 측면에서 보면 뇌장애 밖에서 입체적으로 이해할 수 있습니다.
What does depression actually mean? To depress something is to push it down. What do people push down in depression? They push down their emotions. Yeah. Why would they? Because the emotions are too painful. So even depression becomes as a coping mechanism. You push it down so you don't feel the pain. But then later on, that interferes with your life functioning. And all this is happening when the brain is actually developing. These are the links I began to make, including after I was diagnosed with it. And then despite the fact that a couple of my kids were diagnosed, I knew that this wasn't a genetic disease. It's a coping mechanism which got programmed into the brain. And then when I read the literature on brain development, wow, turns out that the human brain is shaped by the environment, and particularly by the adult-child relationships. And so it all began to make perfect sense to me.
삶 자체가 예측하기 어려운 변수 그 자체이기 때문에 우리는 태어나면서부터 건강한 애착 관계를 통해 난관을 헤쳐나갈 수 있는 능력을 스스로 만들어냅니다.
Human beings, as mammals and even birds, are creatures of attachment. We have to connect and attach because otherwise we don't survive. One interesting thing is that the endorphins, which are the body's internal opiate, which heroin and all the other opiates resemble, they help to facilitate attachment. So if you take infant mice and you knock out their endorphin receptors so they don't have endorphin, opiate activity in their brain, they won't cry for help and separate from their mothers, which would mean that they would die in the wild. And which goes back to what happens early in childhood when there's stress and trauma, these endorphin systems don't develop. And then when people do heroin, it feels like a warm, soft hug to them. They feel love and connection for the first time. That's why it's so powerful.
중독에 빠지기 쉬운 사람들은 자신이 선택해서 중독에 빠진 의지가 박약한 사람들이 아니라 애착을 찾는 행위의 연장선 때문으로 보는 것이 좀 더 정확합니다.
Without which obviously the human infant, who is the most helpless, the most dependent, the least mature of any creature in the universe at birth, cannot survive without the attachment. And that attachment relationship, given that we have the longest period of development of any creature, well into adolescence and beyond, attachment is not a negotiable need.
저자가 트라우마를 전문적으로 연구하게 된 배경입니다.
Was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1944, in January, 2 months before the Germans occupied the country. And Hungary at that time was the only country in Eastern Europe where the Jewish population had not been annihilated. And now it was our turn. So I was 2 months of age. The day after the German army marched into Budapest, my mother phoned the pediatrician to say, would you please come and see Gabor, of course he's crying all the time. And the pediatrician said, of course I will come, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies were crying. And of course, that's the infants picking up on their mother's terror and stress. And that's how I spent the first year of my life, which has had a huge impact on my development and my lifelong struggles with depression, ADHD, self-shame, and other issues. Jumping ahead now, I knew very little about that history. My parents didn't say much about it as I was growing up. I knew my grandparents had been killed in Auschwitz. I knew my father had been in forced labor, and I never saw him for a year and a half. But beyond that, I knew not much about the details until I was about 9 or 10, maybe 11 years old, and there was a book on my parents' shelf in Budapest, which was written by a British civil servant, and it was the first book published in the 50s that detailed the Nazi crimes. And I climbed up on a chair, took down the book, began to read it, saw photographs of the horrors of the concentration camps and the extermination, and all of a sudden I swooned, because I got what happened to my family. And that question of how can people do such things to other human beings would strike me every day, and for years and years and years, dizzy with the question. So why people suffer and why people make other people suffer, and what is the origin of all that? My life's work has been motivated by that question. As a medical doctor, I'm always looking at, well, what is it that makes people be the way they are? Why do we become cruel? Why do we become victims? Why do we become perpetrators? What drives us? What kind of insanity covers our basic human nature and positive?
저자는 중독을 해결하려면 힘 있는 누군가에 의존해서는 안 된다고 말합니다.
We have to find that light within ourselves. We have to find the light within communities and in our own wisdom, in our own creativity. We can't wait for the people in power to make things better for us, because they're never going to, not unless we make them. Human nature is actually community-minded. What we see here at this conference, with people sharing information, people receiving information, people committed to the better world, that's actually human nature. If we find that light within, if we find our own nature, then we'll be kinder to ourselves, and we'll also be kinder to nature. Thank you.